should donors directly target marginalized groups, or should they seek to change political incentives to target those groups? So I suppose the question is, if you have a group of women in a rural area not getting access to healthcare, should you go in either directly or through NGOs to provide that healthcare, or should you try and seek to change the political incentives? So let's start with that one. I would be very interested to get perspectives from the floor on this, and then we'll go back, as I said, to the panelists. So, Hanan.
The suggestion that we are faced with a kind of an either-or binary situation. Since we're all dealing with means of implementation now, I'd perhaps in this particular instance draw attention to instruments such as the Universal Periodic Review, which has been now introduced as a universal instrument to take stock of country progress alongside its human rights commitments from alpha to omega. I mean, it covers the entire gamut. Now, every single country as of 2011 has undertaken and been party to that Universal Periodic Review. And what it does is provide a basis for a conversation between local, national, and international partners on each country's avowed obligations. So once you have that, you have the basis for a conversation on whether it's looking at sustainable transport infrastructure, the scenario we looked at yesterday, all across the lines. And in doing so, you have a basis for a partnership and a dialogue. So I think in the first instance, in conversations such as this, we should be looking to explore and exploit every avenue for commonality and common ground, and use that as the platform for negotiating partner contributions, rather than start with the assumption that we are faced with either-or choices.
Great, I think that's really helpful. Any other responses? Rupert, and then the gentleman from AFD, but Rupert first. Sorry, I think we need the microphone for the online thing. Thanks.
Thanks. Rupert Simons, Publish What You Fund. I think if we flip the question and imagine other countries trying to dictate to this country or any other European country or the US how our government should be treating marginalized groups, we'd find that a pretty awkward conversation. Not necessarily a wrong one, but just extremely awkward. However, one proposed simplification, if we give cash, or at least if we give a lot more cash, to an extent we get around the political problems.
Okay, and the gentleman over here, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Armand Largentet from the French Development Agency. I just wonder whether the question is properly framed. I think there's an important aspect in leaving no one behind, in fact a political aspect indeed, which is, and linked to ownership, which is what is called policy space. And the question I have is whether our concern, the question we have, an AFD, in fact we've made the comment to the OECD report, which focuses on the private sector, is whether our concern for private sector issues, for attracting the private sector in political finance, microeconomic issues, competitiveness, etc., is not leading us to forget or to neglect the macroeconomic aspects of development. In other words, when you're seeking competitiveness, there's a retroactive feature, which is that as you reduce costs and demand, you're affecting the returns to investment and therefore discouraging private investment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have the gentleman here and then Tony behind him.
Thank you. My name is George Waka from Kenya. I think I feel a bit sad in the sense that the concept of leave no one behind is seeking to address the symptoms rather than the root cause. Why did we get here? We got here because of several factors. One, we have cultural, deep cultural issues. Cultural issues are very localized issues. Solutions to cultural issues can never be a development agenda from someone outside. It is really a local. That's why I agree with him that country-specific issues are very important for solution of leave no one behind. The other aspects is resource competition. Resource competition that is internal as well as resource competition that is external. If you look at certain fragile states, the resource competition is really a localized issue. It's a geographical issue. You can't solve it. If my region has resources and your region does not have resources, I give an example of my own country. Certain areas of my own country have wildlife. Wildlife is a major economic issue because it brings in tourism. The issues of tourism are national because they are a revenue stream for the national government. Therefore, the concept of marginalization starts with, to what extent do the local enjoy the resources that are localized to them but are being made national without, that creates conflict. It also creates conflict in the same region. There are cultural issues. Why take a girl to school when a boy is in the home? I mean, those are very cultural issues. And therefore, that creates the element of the female population having to be marginalized by default. Because given a choice in a poverty environment where the resources don't exist, and a parent has to make a choice, several times they have made it a choice and say, look, in my culture, the lady will go away anyway. She'll get married off to go to another village. But the man will always remain here. Why don't I educate this one who will remain here? That's a very localized issue that is geographical, again, in our place. The other resource competition is external. Look at the Congo problem. Even as you sing about leave no one behind, unless what he has said, the private profit issue is addressed, the leave no behind concept is going nowhere. Like my brother said yesterday, we will simply find it hard, set it aside and develop a new development agenda and move on. And those are realities we'll face 10 years from today. I hope we'll be in this room to review. The other aspects is I'm a bit worried. The concept of leave no one behind sets the stage for laziness rewards mantra. Let's sit back, let's do nothing, and claim we are marginalized. Let everybody around us work and bend over to pick us. And that's going to happen. Even in a family, the leave no one behind concept works at family level. You have 3 brothers, one doesn't simply work hard, gets babies, and you have to take the babies to school. So you bend over to reward laziness. Do we want to set the world agenda on that particular framework? The other aspects is, I equate the concept of leave no one behind to the concept of ethics. Can you really legislate around ethics? It is deep in you. You are either ethical by upbringing or you are not. However much we can talk about ethics from now to end, we really can't bring you in. The same concept of leave no one behind. To what extent is something that is personal? And therefore, the development agenda needs to focus on how to make it possible to have these aspects change from. And that's why I have a suggestion. The suggestion is that as we go to Nairobi, we have the following focus, a tripartite approach to leave no one behind. The first concept is, because national issues are very localized, in the concept of Busan principles, the first principle of ownership will be the principle of setting the agenda for leave no one behind. What the development partners should do is the second is a triangular format. The second tip of the triangle is the development agenda. The development agenda of the development agencies should focus on institutional development. As a country, legislate identify your agenda, create a national platform for Leave No One Behind. Let the development partners bring in the concept of institutional development within your own framework. And then the third and the most critical is the civil society group. The element of transparency, accountability, of how well we are performing in terms of Leave No One Behind should be really the agenda of the civil society. Because they are the ones who are local enough to check government on local issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll just allow Tony, and then I do want to give the panel a chance to come back, but we're going to go to the second question so we can pick up some more observations on that. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. The question of, I don't think there is a tension or contradiction between the Busan principle of ownership and leaving no one behind. We think that leaving no one behind is really an iteration of the results principle, except that it's a better understanding what results mean. Now, operationally, you can look at results in different ways, impact, and so on. But the politics of results is really leaving no one behind. And therefore, in that sense, we can look at questions of aid predictability, the question of ensuring that marginalized do get not just the fair share, but there should be, in the context of HRBA, effective action and so on. And therefore, it's still within the Busan principles, if you will. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to ask the panel to come back on this question, and I have one or two observations to make as well. So, Helder.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments made by distinguished participants, but let me just quickly address the question that is on the screen. Should donors directly target marginalized groups or seek to change political incentives to target left behind groups? It's a question of principle here. But as I said in my argument, at the end of the day, when you are at the country level, you're dealing with the government here. And the government, with all the imperfections, with all the limitations we have, the government also is trying its best with a good intention at setting up their own national development plan, national strategies, by bringing all the marginalized people and all the vulnerable groups, the elderly, the ex-combatants, and so on and so forth, to bring on board, engage in this policy discussion at the country level. So if you ask, should donors directly target marginalized groups, it's fine in principle, in my view. You can come up with your assistance, go and target them. But remember, you're dealing with the issue of ownership at the national level here. There should be a kind of like a policy dialogue, bringing together civil societies, governments, development partners, business community, private sector, young people, youth, and so on. Bring together at the national level to discuss what are the areas that need to be targeted by external donors. Otherwise, my worry is this, that you are bypassing the national system, the very principle that we discussed about the principle of ownership at the national level. Thank you.
Thank you. Javier.
Some questions arising from your participations. First, I will take the question here, and my answer is pretty simple. I think that both, but it will depend on the particular context. Sometimes you can work trying to change political incentives, and sometimes you have not any chance to open a dialogue with the recipient government. So in that cases, I think that is it possible and maybe desirable to work directly with a marginalized group. I mean, we have not to abandon any option of work as a previous question. I think that we need to face any situation in its particularity. And let me add some small pills, easy to swallow pills, if you let me call it that way. About cultural issues, I'm sure that the cultural issues have a strong weight in our decisions, and we saw the cultural discussions when we tried to write our 2030 agenda. It was a very, very important issue, and we saw very deep discussions about questions about like how to understand the world life, or how to understand family, or sexual and reproductive rights. So we all know pretty good the cultural question and the centrality of the cultural question in this process. But I think that I tried to refer to the cultural questions when I spoke about perceptions. I mean, the vulnerable groups and the groups that are being left behind are not only social groups, but social constructions about what their groups are. And in that case, we need to consider the social perceptions, and the social perceptions are always cultural perceptions. For example, I mean, maybe it have no sense to include the consideration on some groups in some countries, but we need to consider it in some others. In the work that we are writing just now with ODO, for example, we took the case of the minors in Nigeria or Sudan. The minors are a vulnerable group in those countries with a high possibility to be ill of tuberculosis, for example, of get TB. But minors are not a left behind group in some other contexts and countries. The same could happen with, for example, people in prisons. Are we thinking about the people in prisons like a vulnerable or marginalized group? And what about the hard drugs users? Are them a marginalized group, a vulnerable group, or not? So the cultural issue, it's a very hard issue, and the construction of the group, it's a cultural construction also. The tensions that was mentioned also here, and the need of respect the sovereignty and the ownership principle, I think that could be compared with a more familiar situation. Let's say we live in one world, we have no other. Maybe someday we will have the possibility to choose in which world we live, but not today. And we are in a neighborhood in which not all the neighbors love each other. So we need to live together even if we are not happy with them. And it leads us to the ethics questions. We can and we must apply, of course, ethic questions, since we are again in the cultural field, but which ethics? Because again, there is a lot of interpretation about what ethic is. And yes, and I think that the only global ethics that we have and we need to apply is the human rights treaties. I think that we can not forget that we are talking about human rights. And I want to underline that line.
Thank you very much. We will go to another round of questions, but I just wanted to very quickly make some observations based on the study that I mentioned that we're doing for the Leave No One Behind group, which is also fed into this policy brief that you have in your pack, which was very much looking around all of the Busan principles and what happens if you apply a Leave No One Behind lens to them. I think Tony alluded to this. We think about results. Well, clearly, which results? Which results and for which group? So we're not just then talking about, you know, children in school, but which children? Is it girl children, boy children, ethnic minority children, and so on? And I think the transparency and accountability agenda is where you can particularly apply a Leave No One Behind lens about which data are you making transparent and who who are you making it transparent to, and how accessible is it to particularly some left behind groups, where we actually have an enormous way to go to actually do this. And what I'm hearing from the room and also from the speakers is that there isn't necessarily a tension between ownership and leave no one behind, but we need to think about what do those strategies look like? Do they include an analysis of who is left behind? Do they include a debate at the national level about who's left behind? And bearing in mind some of these, often quite difficult and sensitive cultural issues about how do you identify these people? How much do you know about them? So actually it could be a very helpful lens to put on ownership, to think that that debate has to put marginalized groups front and center and their identification. So this is a little bit related to the next question we have, which is, what can we do about supporting vulnerable or marginalized groups that governments would have chosen or would choose to leave behind? And as you can see, these were the questions that were overwhelmingly voted for here, so I think this is the nub of the matter. So I'll go to the floor on that, and if anybody has any observations from the last question, they can also add those. So Isabella, and then Simon, and then the gentleman here.
Romilly, and thank you everybody for the input. I have a small observation regarding the last question, and probably to keep in mind for this one, to come back to what Rupert said. I think it's, so the SDGs are a universal agenda, and I think that that's something we should keep in mind. I keep myself falling into the trap myself of talking north-south, talking donor, recipient, this and that. I think we have to talk about mutual accountability, and that, because as Mr. McKenney says here next to me, think also of European countries. People are left behind here as well in many ways. So I don't know what kind of mechanisms we could come up with, or the international community could come up with, to, I'd say, not peer pressure, but leading by example, having an honest dialogue, an honest debate at country level, sharing, and learning from each other. I'm dealing with this, how you're doing this. And of course, I'm not bagatellizing, and to be very clear that during the HLM2, because, so we are all working towards implementing the best way and universal sustainable development agenda. At the same time, because the Leave No One Behind agenda is so broad, we had to make a choice to discuss on fragile and conflict-affected states and marginalized groups in middle-income countries. But please remind yourself of mechanisms that would include mutual accountability between donor countries, recipient countries, and what to do about people in our own country. So that's my 5 cents worth.
Yeah, so Simon.
Thanks. Actually, one of the questions, Romilly, is for you. I want to know what you think we should do about all those countries that don't respect human rights in terms of homosexuality and so on. I think the context for this, for me, is that we are fighting a battle to the death to defend aid. In the UK, we talk about the Daily Mail effect, where there are many stories about corruption, abuse of human rights, people left behind in this way, with the obvious implication that the right thing for donors to do is to walk away. And without expressing a personal view, some of the cases that get most discussed in the British press at the moment are Rwanda and Ethiopia, two donor darlings who feature very much in this kind of discussion. And I just think that if we're going to have this discussion about leaving no one behind, it is not a technocratic question about how to identify what the Indians used to say was the last person in the last row in the last village. It's not about how you find the handicapped and help them. It's actually about how you deal with egregious human rights and political abuses. And we should be thinking as donors about all the instruments at our disposal, which start with conditionality on aid, not funding governments, only funding NGOs, and end up with liberal interventionism and invasion. And so let's not have a technocratic discussion, but let's really address this. And don't forget to answer my question, Romilly, about you would like to do about those very difficult cases.
Okay, that's a challenge for me. Thank you. So I said the gentleman here, and then we'll go to Alistair.
Thank you. I think
we'll come to you next.
this was a very interesting comment, because if you start from the proposition that fragility and conflict are global public goods, or to put it really crudely, if a government marginalizes people in its country, it unleashes a flood of migrants, then these are not just local problems. From a donor perspective, they're our problem too. And that, I think, if you take a global public goods view of this, you have a different set of arguments to a distributional argument saying that some people are left behind for if you like, for economic, for budget reasons, for trade-off between consumption and investment and so on. Because in industrialized countries, there are a lot of people left behind because of technological change, because of globalization, and there's a certain hypocrisy in lecturing to other countries about this. But if you say, what you do in your country is actually going to affect us donors, then it becomes a different dialogue, and becomes perhaps politically easier to have a very frank and dialogue along the ways that Simon mentioned. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alistair. And the gentleman here. By the way, I don't want to leave any women behind. I'm very concerned. We've had a lot of male voices speaking, so if there's any women who would like to speak up, please don't hesitate. Okay. Great, two over here. So we'll go to this gentleman and then these two.
I'm Fadla Woma from Muslim Aid. I'd just like to ask, how does this relate to the SDGs, which all governments have agreed to, like inequality? So basically, everybody signed up to that. So how can we hold governments, all governments, accountable? And then let's look at the issue of refugees. Let's look at how Myanmar treats its Rohingya. Mm-hmm. Let's look at how Australia treats its refugees. So how does Australia treat its Aborigines? So how do we hold both Western and recipient, whatever you want to call them, countries, to account for the SDGs, which is a universal good? And I think still I'd like to go back to the thing I said yesterday, the thing about inequitable trade and financial practices. I think that has to come up in Nairobi somewhere. Someone has to hold to account the inequitable trading system of the world, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, these systems that hold countries in trust, and the French that tie their former African colonies countries to the euro. So how these inequitable trading systems have to be discussed in Nairobi, and we have to work a way out of them, because that is destroying any development that we're going to go ahead with. So I've raised a lot of issues. I hope that we could look at a few of them. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, and just finally, there's $32 trillion in tax havens. $32 trillion. What are we going to do about that?
Okay, I'm going to go to the two ladies that we have here. Then I'll quickly go to Amy, then we'll come back to the panel, because I think we need to finish for 11:30. So we have the lady here.
Hi. I just want to add something. My name is Lungile. I'm from South Africa, involved with an NGO there. And in terms of some of the things that's been raised, leaving no one behind, I mean, the previous speaker spoke about, what do we do with people left behind in the donor countries like UK or US. There's no comparison. You cannot compare a developing country with a developed country in terms of resources and in terms of the development. It's just no comparison. I'm from South Africa. I came back on Thursday. you are talking about something as basic as Wi-Fi in terms of access just to use internet. I mean, I was using pounds, I ran out of pounds. You know, there was a time where, but there's no way I'm going to, you know, buy this internet. And then I realized how many people are left behind in even something as basic as internet, you know. And one of the things, another speaker mentioned Rwanda. I was in Rwanda in June, and one of the person I spoke to mentioned in terms of aid and countries like UK and US, when they take aid and development in countries, they don't use local people. They bring their own manpower, they bring their own skilled people. They don't want to bring development in a localized grassroots in terms of bringing development in a country, skills, training, you know. I mean, I'm from South Africa. Everybody knows that Mandela spoke about brain drain, whereby all the skilled everybody knows about the apartheid system in South Africa, whereby, you know, education was black and white. And then white people have left with the skills. We've got brain drain, left the country with no skills, with no education, with no training. Surely the government in South Africa will be very happy if people can come and bring the development in terms of skills, training, give back in those countries. We've got a history of colonization, you know, going back centuries ago. And then in cases where the question was talking about vulnerable, marginalized groups, what do? I'm not talking about invading the country. How about talking and engaging with those marginalized people? You know, go there and work with the NGOs. I was in South Africa, I came back last week. I met about 5 NGOs there who said to me, as we had a meeting with them, they said, oh, we're so happy we are talking about this because a lot of people coming from abroad, they come here, do research, just ask questions, and then they go away. That's their development. We need to really look, what do we mean when we talk about development? Are we giving skills? Are we giving training? Or are we just going there to do research, ask questions as Europeans, and go away? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, just the 2 last final questions, and I'll go back to the panel. And I will answer your questions, Simon. Don't worry. Anna. Yeah.
Hi, Anna Thomas. I'm just thinking about the question at the heading of this session. Does leaving nowhere behind trump country ownership? This debate is clearly crucial about the addressing of marginalized groups, and I don't think there are easy answers. I just wanted to sort of speak up for country ownership. So I think you can say that anyone who is poor is a member of a marginalized group, and poor people need decent public services. And 5-10 years, well, maybe 10 years ago, donors were all saying some countries are choosing their own development priorities and finding the best way to try to build up those services, and they need donor support for finance to do that. And that is still the case in many countries. And it just feels like that is getting completely lost in current debates. And I mean, it's still, donors are still supporting that kind of thing. I just wonder for how much longer.
Great. Amy, you've got about 30 seconds because we've got about 4 minutes left. So,
Amy Dodd from the UK Aid Network. And I guess I just wanted to say, and sort of building maybe on what Anna was saying as well, I think we get a little bit captured sometimes when we talk about ownership, about the idea that it is just about government ownership. So country ownership is about a lot of different things beyond that. So it is democratic ownership, it is people and stuff as well. So I think we shouldn't get too tied up in knots about, you know, whether or not it's just kind of the government who's in charge. And I think building on that, remembering we've done a lot of work and thinking over many, many years about how we reconcile that challenge between wanting to do things that the duly or unduly elected government might not want to do, thinking particularly about human rights NGOs or something like that, working in places where they're often working maybe in contravention to what the government might want to be doing. So maybe we should be pulling some of the lessons from that a bit.
Great, thank you. Okay, I will go back to the panel. Helder, would you like to go first?
Thank you. It certainly enriched my understanding of this leave no one behind. But in my closing remarks, I'd like to come up with 2 or 3 messages only. First, when you talk about leave no one behind, we, the fragile and conflict-affected states, our stakes are very high, because we run the risk of being left behind for the next 15 years if we don't tackle it very carefully, prudently, and carefully for the next 15 years. And I'd like to give a big hand to whoever wrote that illustration there. It's like you're riding a bus, and that bus call, I wouldn't say leaving no one behind, but I would say that bus calls Agenda 2030 or SDGs. And the bus is starting already last year, 1 year down. And 14 years to go, and we have another journey for 14 years until we reach 2030. And by then, we look back to Tony Tujan's concept, look at the results. What have we achieved, the results in 2030, whether we really left behind those who are marginalized and conflict-affected states. Second message, I'm a very practical person, and we talk real people here. Last month, the G7 Plus led a mission to Central African Republic at the invitation of the Prime Minister. We met with the President, we met with the Prime Minister, we met with the warring factions, the anti-Balaka and Seleka, and also we met with the refugees. You know how many refugees in Central African Republic? 400,000. And the majority are scattered around the border between Central African Republic, DRC, Chad, and so on. But there are 28,000 refugees are living right in the airport. While at the same time, MINUSCA, which has an operational cost $1 million a day. Sorry? Oh, thank you. I have half a minute, so I'll need to finalize this. Thank you. Anyway, to cut the long story short, if we really want to help leaving no one behind, the Central African Republic is going to have its donors pledging conference next month, in Brussels on the 17th of November. So that links back to the question that was put by Tom Hart here. How can donors target the marginalized group? This is the challenge for you, the donors, if you really want to help the refugees in Central African Republic at the airport, because they have been marginalized by their own government, and the very issue that I'm talking about. The last, just 10 seconds. The last point I'd like to say is this. Let's go to Nairobi. And Nairobi is a non-binding document. The same thing applies to Busan. But after Busan, 6 years down the track, we still talk about ownership, talk about harmonization, talk about results. And the final point is this. Let's roll our sleeves up and work at the country level in order to respect the spirit of global light and country-heavy focus. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helder. Javier, sorry, you've got about 1 minute, otherwise David will tell me off, which will be a bad thing.
I just want to take some inputs from the last session, and let me say that as far as I see, the multi-stakeholders partnerships are the main tool to implement the 2030 agenda. And it leads us to 3 specific points. First, countries and other stakeholders must start to learn from our failed experiences. We have a lot of time learning or trying to learn from our successful histories and sharing histories about successful experiences. And we need to start to learn from our mistakes. And the private sector do this pretty well, and we have a lot to learn from the private sector in this specific issue, for example. Let me also say that 2030 agenda is a universal agenda, and it means that donors have to learn to think in itself as developing countries. It means to change completely your mindset about where you are in development and where you must be in the next 15 years. And to finalize, let me also say that let me put a big red banner with the word danger on it, because when we talk about accountability, we are creating a new risk of left people behind. Accountability also set a twofold challenge of leave no one behind and data. And there are, first, are you being counted? Are the left behind people being counted? And second, are the leave behind people ready to understand the histories that statistical history are telling to us? Because if not, we are creating new ways of accountability exclusion, and we are leaving behind new groups in our society. Finally, we need to work with the people who left behind. We need to hear them, we need to meet them, we need to know them, and we need to let them take their own decisions. Don't re-exclude this group. Don't leave them out of the implementation process. They have a lot to tell to us, and they have a lot of knowledges and abilities that we have not. And we must understand and respect this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier. I think that's been a really interesting discussion. I guess there's two key headlines that I would take away from this. Firstly, I think the answer to the question, does leave no one behind Trump country ownership, is no, from what I've heard from around the room. We didn't have a vote, but I think this is what I'm hearing. But I think for Leave No One Behind, I think actually all the Busan principles, we need to have a rethink of how they apply for leaving no one behind. And I think on ownership, there's been some really interesting suggestions, including from Hanan on this review process, from Javier also on the identification and the culturally and locally specific identification of left behind groups. So thinking about ownership needs to be central. And I think in all of this, your point about including vulnerable groups, it's going to be a very different way of doing things. So that's the first issue. And then the second issue is, it's come up a lot that this is not just a southern agenda. This is not about a north-south agenda. This is very much around a global, a universal agenda, and particularly the issue of refugees and the sort of spillovers. So I think if we stop thinking about it as something that's particularly to do with southern countries or development, that's enormously helpful. 2 seconds in response to Simon. I mean, I think that external actors both need to get in there with the marginalized groups and support those groups, and also engage in policy dialogue with the government. It's a bit of a wishy-washy answer. I'm personally a bit of an interventionist. That may be a bit controversial, but that would be my 2 pennies worth, that, you know, you can't just walk away and say the countries have got to get on with it. And as you say, it is linked to a kind of wider political and foreign policy concerns, and we need to see it with that lens. Right, apologies, David, I've gone 5 minutes over, so you'll tell us what. Have we got 15 minutes for coffee, or David will come and tell us? Oh, and sorry, while he's coming up, a round of applause, please, for the panelists. I thought it was really interesting.